Under the midday sun, which was so white that it appeared to bleach the sky itself, the Nevada desert burnt. Other than the restless figures in the middle of the round pen and the glimmer of heat above the hard pan, uncooked earth, nothing moved. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to break, while the air crackled with a dry, electric tension. The hooves of a horse whose name echoed across the ranch caused the dust to swirl across the ring in slow spirals. Storm is a large Mustang for his type, a study in raw muscle and scars, with a coat that is a patchwork of newly cut and healed wounds. He wasn't your typical bronc. Even the wranglers, men who had witnessed wild Mustangs brought to their knees, spoke of Storm with a mixture of caution, wonder, and dread that they would never publicly acknowledge. He now stood in the middle of the circular corral, his ribs visible in the intense light, every muscle taut as wire, and his hides black and grey stains from perspiration. A fresh welt seared crimson against the scars on his shoulder, and a thin trickle of blood ran down it. Even when a lady came with a long black whip curving and uncurling in her gloved hand, leather chaps creaking, and boots sending up a fresh cloud of dust, he remained motionless. Ramona? Her family is the spread's owner, and their name is etched on the ranch's gate and reputation. Her eyes were as keen as the sun itself, and she was tall and angular. She exuded authority like a brand, but now her jaw was clenched with something sharp and perilous, and her mouth was set in a thin, grim line. A dozen hands gathered around the fence rails, motionless and with their faces drawn, each man and woman burdened by the ranch's unspoken law. What Ramona said, happened. However, there was a change in the atmosphere. Storm was more than just a legend. Breaking a wild horse was no longer the only goal. Like a shroud of thorns, pride had infiltrated Ramona's shoulders. With its shadow fluttering across the sand, she lifted the whip and cracked it with such force that the sound of thunder shattered the sky. Storm remained unflinching. His nostrils widened and his ears perked, but his gaze remained fixed on hers. Unwavering, unblinking. As though the heat itself were crushing everyone flat into the ground, the silence lingered, dense and weird. With her boots scratching and her voice low, Ramona walked around giving crisp orders. With every unsuccessful attempt to cow the Mustang, the whip continued to strike, her rage growing. Storm's muscles bunched under his coat like coiled springs as he made a single lunge, not out of fear but to test the limits. The arid air was a mixture of sweat and blood, dust and pride. As if sensing drama far older than any ranch quarrel, a vulture circled high above the valley somewhere in the backdrop. As the horse stamped, the buzzing flies dispersed from their spots in the corners of his wounds. A single tumbleweed caught briefly on a stray nail before continuing on its way, rolling against the fence. Ramona's gaze flitted around, looking for any indication that the beast was about to snap. With his head held high and his legs spread wide, Storm simply squared his stance. Yes, he was beaten, but he was still intact. He held fast to the tale of his past, tales of a stallion who had escaped roundups 3 times, outlived wildfires, and survived battles with mountain lions. The map of all human struggles and unsuccessful attempts to claim his spirit was engraved on his physique. Something briefly flashed in Ramona's face, a fleeting, unguarded tremor that only those closest could see. A man with hands as rough as old rope, one of the wranglers, shifted uneasily. Despite being inconspicuous, it spread. The other hands looked at one another, distrust growing in the heat as their eyes narrowed. What did it say about the woman's attempt to break Storm if he was able to stand straight after everything he had been through? Ramona felt ashamed. Her voice was now thinner, and the rhythm of her directions wavered, but she persisted, pushing herself just as hard as the horse. She whipped the sand close to Storm's hoofs, causing a grit sting to fly up and lash back into her face when it caught in the wind. Her voice cracked as she cursed, and for a split second, She didn't look like the ranch's sovereign but rather like a lady who had been exposed in front of her people. Silence, rather than a cry, relieved the stress. With his head held high, Storm rotated his body to expose his wounds to the sunlight. Every ancient hurt was a silent protest against the idea of ownership, and every scar gleamed. He was still. Completely still? Every breath was a vow that he would not bend, no matter how much it hurt, and the only movement was the slow, deep rise and fall of his sides. Some of the hands at the fence lowered their gaze, while others straightened. Nobody applauded. Nobody made a move. As though the land itself had sided with Storm, there was a sense of weight in the air. Even the horses in the nearby corrals froze, their ears perked up at the circular enclosure. Ramona's arm shook as she lowered her whip. For the first time, she felt the chill of judgment rather than obedience as she turned to face her crew on the fence. Her back was straight as she walked out of the arena, but her pride was limping and there were unseen fissures in her armor. With sweat and blood drying on his skin and dust swirling at his feet, Storm stood by himself in the circular pen. That day, the story of the Unbreakable Mustang spread, whispered in the bunkhouse, passed over the dinner table, and inscribed in the sand by the hoofs of all the horses that observed him. Here, under the blazing Nevada heat, disobedience might be a form of liberation. However, there was always a cost. And the reckoning was far from over for Storm. The desert dawn arrived quickly and harshly, its merciless light erasing the night's faint bruises. Before the heat of the day set in, there was first only quiet, the hush of anticipation. However, behind that serenity, there was a sense of urgency in the ranch air, as though even the sagebrush was aware that the rules had changed. Ramona was already awake in the large barn, pacing like a caged leopard, her eyes ringed with a restless desire. Her presence surged through the crew like electricity, but she hardly regarded the ranch hands gathered in the yard. Despite their reluctance to speak first, everyone felt compelled to move in order to be useful and stay out of her piercing gaze. The sting of yesterday was still fresh under her skin, as she drummed her fingers on her denim and looked out over the horizon. She had taken a decision in the midst of a heat of pride and wounded ego because the tale of Storm, the Mustang that refused to bend, had started to undermine her authority. She would put an end to this today. Tradition and round pen games are over. No horse would be able to avoid the hunt that would take place in the desert. Her voice was quiet, but it crackled with steely purpose as she ordered the dirt bikes fueled, and the pickup truck prepped. With his flanks still scarred from yesterday's trauma, Storm stood alone in his pen at the far end of the corral. He hadn't eaten much. Dust was already collecting on the trough's surface, and the water level was low. But the same old defiance shone in his eyes. Like a sixth sense, his ears flicked back and forth as he observed every movement and moving shadow, interpreting the morning's intentions. There was an impending event? He sensed it. The ranch came alive as the first rays of sunlight peeked over the far ridge. With their guns hanging loosely but not forgotten, two men clambered into old ATVs with dust scarves drawn high across their faces. Boots crunching on the gravel, doors slamming, the pickup truck's engine roaring to life. With a pair of heavy gloves clasped in one hand and a whip still hanging at her hip, Ramona herself moved toward the gate. This would not be another ritual, that much was apparent. It would be the last one and a chase. As the noise increased, the confined horses were startled into a chorus of apprehensive snorts and hoofbeats on the planks. Storm's ears pricked upward. He heard the old gate groan as it swung wide, saw the guys circling, and heard the latch shatter. For one instant, everything froze. In the liminal region between freedom and fear, time stayed suspended. Then Storm rushed forward with such suddenness that even onlookers were taken aback. He surged for the opening, muscles bunching as his hooves hit the earth in a shower of dust. It was too late when the ranch hands yelled. With a force that shook the hinges, he crashed against the gate, the wood creaking with the impact. The chain broke. With a bang against the post, the ancient padlock came loose. Meanwhile, tail streaming behind him like a banner of defiance, the Mustang was through and running into the yard. Ramona's voice broke through the commotion as she yelled commands. With tires squealing, the vehicle sped ahead. With a roar, the ATVs came to life and began to tear off in a shower of sand and gravel. They were hunting. Storm sprinted. His body was beaten, and every instinct cried out for flight. He ran across the yard, jumped over a dilapidated fence, ducked between structures, and avoided the broken boards and tangled web of wire. Hot blood trickled down his shoulder as a loose piece of barbed wire sliced across his chest, causing him to sting, but he did not slow. Pain and adrenaline combined to create something crisp and pure, survival. Beyond the property lay a maze of rock, bush, and dust. Breath came in quick, forceful gasps as the storm struck the broad desert. He was almost immediately surrounded by dirt motorcycles, the harsh roar of engines piercing the serenity of the morning. Intent on penning him in and guiding him back toward the main road, the riders stooped low, their goggles blazing and their boots poised above foot pegs. Dust plumes shot into the blue as the truck thundered behind, bouncing over shallow ruts. However, Storm was wild, born in this nation, molded by its promise and savagery. He increased his speed and swerved in the direction of a little wash that sliced the land like a scar from long ago. With wheels spinning and gravel spitting from under their tires, the dirt bikes attempted to cut him off. The bike swung sideways when it struck a piece of loose gravel, and one rider yelled. The man barely managed to hang on, his profanity lost in the wind. With muscles shivering from the exertion and hooves skittering, Storm raced sideways and discovered the smallest sign of a game trail winding down into the narrow valley. With dust choking his nostrils and sand flying, he dove into the wash. The world briefly shrank to the sound of his heartbeat, the roar of pursuit behind him, and the raw burn of fresh cuts as he scraped past sage and thorn. The ground shifted under his hoofs as he ducked under a stand of yucca, and jumped a fallen log. Wheels tore at the ground and engines screamed behind them, yet the wash twisted and swirled, the banks rising and lowering, a maze that only those born into the wild could decipher. With her face fixed and her knuckles white on the driving wheel, Ramona stared as Storm vanished into the arroyos and canyons. She swore, and a glimmer of uncertainty briefly appeared in her eyes. After everything, could this animal possibly outrun and outthink her? She wouldn't quit, though. Orders flew, herd him toward the ridge, swing the motorcycles wide, and block the north trail. As the sun rose higher, the ranch hands, enmeshed in the chase's frenzy, continued to work, engines roaring, perspiration pouring down their cheeks. Every step was a struggle, and Storm's breath was raspy as the blood dried on his chest. But with his senses sharpened, he continued. Storm turned away, hoofs clattering on loose stone, while a coyote yipped somewhere ahead, frightened by the confusion. A rattlesnake slipped out of his way and vanished under a rock. Every threat was alive, and every second was teetering on the brink of catastrophe or escape. The earth opened up ahead, revealing a shallow basin that was sun-baked and speckled with ancient stones and sage. Stretched out, legs flying, the pain vanishing beneath the ecstasy of movement, the wild pulse of hope, Storm found his stride. The ground became rocky and unpredictable, and the engines were having a hard time keeping up with the fences, which were now far behind. Storm had disappeared into the never-ending web of the desert by the time the pursuit stalled, dust collecting in sluggish clouds. He had read the earth, followed his gut, and discovered a freedom that was not without risk. The ranch was left behind him with a shattered fence, a trembling crew, and a legend that would only get stronger with time. However, the curse had not yet been removed. The storm's flight was just the start. Ancient and patient, the desert observed that escape was never easy, and that every triumph had a price. The last of the sun's gold burned out along the sharp teeth of far-off mountains as night came over the Nevada basin like a shroud, blue becoming to indigo. Even after the chase was hours over, Storm's mind was still plagued by the sound of motors and the recollection of piercing, barking cries. Untethered and alone, he plunged farther into the unknown. Darkness transformed the desert. A sharp chill pressed near the earth, slipping along every crevice and depression as the heat disappeared. After his hide was scored by barbed wire, Storm hobbled forward, his shoulder scorching. Sweat and blood dried on his coat, hardening to a crust as each breath steamed in the cold. Here, there was only the vast silence of untamed territory and the coded language of animals adapted for survival, no fence, no human voice. There was a single side-heaving misstep by the Mustang. Exhaustion and a pain that went all the way to his bones replaced the waning adrenaline. He stopped in the lee of a boulder, ears turning to listen for noises of pursuit, flanks rising and falling. Save there was nothing save the distant yip of a coyote, and the wind moving across parched sage. As hunger tore at his stomach, his world narrowed to the scratch of his own hooves and the cold encroaching. With each stride a careful balancing act with agony, he made his way over rocky washes, stones clattering beneath his feet. He found himself chasing the faint, priceless, almost imagined aroma of water as it loomed, pallid under the rising moon. He recalled this sensation from a previous existence, when he and his group had traversed miles of harsh terrain with their noses to the wind, each drop of water earned. Flashes of storms past resurfaced, including a dusty canyon, a snake's rattle, a cougar's stinging claw, and the frantic escape from the wildfires that had previously darkened half the horizon. Every memory taught us something. Survival required more than simply good fortune, it required willpower and memories ingrained in bone and muscle. His strength was waning now, and he needed every lesson. Finally, he discovered a small crevice in the rock, partially obstructed by shadow and tumbleweed. There was a slight trickle of water flowing around the base where the rock cried from a secret spring, and the air was cooler here. His tongue was as dry and thick as old leather as he nosed forward, almost collapsing. Even though the water was thin, it tasted clean, metallic and sharp, promising that he would be okay for another hour or perhaps another day. His nerves were all tense as he took long, deliberate gulps of water. The cold stone calmed the throbbing in his shoulder, numbing the anguish as the wound pulsed with every heartbeat. Above, the city dwellers would never be able to see the stars strewn across the sky with unfathomable clarity. As the only living thing for miles, Storm stood motionless for a while, shivering in the moonlight. The silence was abruptly broken by a coyote's melancholy howl that reverberated throughout the valley. Storm tightened, instinct taking over. He recalled spending evenings together, linked together, with his flanks drawn close for protection and warmth. He was by himself now, and the sound squirmed inside his skin, causing his muscles to tremble as he drew near the rock. Tiny eyes watched from somewhere in the undergrowth, the desert teeming with life that was both hungry and cautious. Owls blinked, snakes slipped out of their tunnels, and rabbits froze. Flaring his nose, Storm sniffed for the odor of ancient danger. The world was a web of possibilities and dangers. He was a part of this land, even now, weak and injured, in a way that no gate or rope could take away from him. The pain of loneliness increased as the night went on. Half-remembered dreams of the herd's thunderous run, the security of numbers, and the melodies of freedom sung under a blood-red dawn filled Storm's thoughts. He missed them as a force as well as a memory. Only what you created for yourself was secure out here. He huffed his air slowly and unevenly as he curled against the rock, head low. But something within him resisted giving up. The worst of the thirst was relieved by the water. The stone provided cover. Each star overhead signified a new challenge overcome and another night survived. Storm refused to let the thread of life break, despite the howling of coyotes and the wind rattling the parched scrub. Storm roused himself as dawn painted the east with a faint promise, threatening the darkness. The agony had lessened, but it was still there. A tribute to the price of freedom, his body was a map of the conflicts he had faced and the wounds he had sustained. His leg was unsteady but functional when he tested it. He was compelled to walk as hunger gnawed at his insides, sharper now. Every inch of the world, which was colder and larger than any paddock, required respect. He limped toward the promise of daylight, stopping occasionally to re-drink. The desert appeared to observe him, unbiased and silent, a judge unaffected by pain. Weakness meant nothing out here, only willpower and the determination to keep going in spite of the obstacles were important. He stopped to rip off a few bitter leaves as he passed a stand of ancient sage. It stabilized him, although the taste was harsh. When he got close, a jackrabbit ran away, its white tail disappearing into the darkness. He made his way up the ridge along a thin game trail, each stride weighed against fatigue and agony. The sun exploded above the world's rim as he arrived at the summit, illuminating the surrounding area. Even though the cold was still holding on to his skin and the wounds on his shoulder hurt, Storm stared up at the miles of untamed terrain that extended to every horizon. This was his new world, one that was both dangerous and promising. The murmur of pursuit had died away somewhere far behind. But there was still hunger, uncertainty, and 1,000 dangers ahead. Nevertheless, Storm experienced the slightest glimmer of hope as he stood silhouetted against the dawn, a savage Mustang by himself in the merciless wilderness. He was alone, wounded, and being hunted, but he was still alive. And it was sufficient for another day. The final ragged remnants of mist along the rocky basin were burned away as the sun rose higher. With every stride a test of how much his shattered body could endure, Storm's world shrank to the beat of his own ragged breaths and the pain in his shoulder. With only the crunch of gravel underfoot and the distant, restless wind as his soul sounds, he continued to follow the glimmering promise of water and the lingering recollection of the herd. He had to stop by midday due to tiredness. The ground was dotted with wiry sage and brittle grass, and he discovered a shallow hole where the rocks provided some partial shade. His shoulder was raw and angry, covered with dust and small insects, but the cut had scabbed. Storm's side hurt every time he moved, yet the world only provided necessities, not solace. When he sniffed through the thicket, all he could taste was the bitterness of dried stalks and the remembrance of a green field in a different world. He became aware of the difference at that point. There was a slight tension in the air, like the instant before thunder, but it wasn't actually a sound. He lifted his head, nostrils wide, ears twitching, searching for anything strange among the strong, sun-scorched scents. Half shaded by a stand of juniper, a person squatted at the edge of the clearing, motionless as a rock. A human, but not in the position he had come to fear. Storm's heart pounded. No lasso ready, no rope in hand, no predatory assurance. This individual sat low, with their legs up, their eyes firm but not menacing, and their hat pulled down to block out the glare. They hardly breathed, and did not move. He recognized it as a woman, a stranger, not one of the dusty, yelling ranch crew. Harper had arrived stealthily, his boots muffled in the sand and every step purposeful. She was familiar with the language of caution from her previous experiences watching the wild bands. She knew how to sit without looming, how to keep her hands visible and her voice quiet, and how to stoop so she appeared smaller. She waited, never interrupting, her presence a soft punctuation in the wilderness. There was an implicit agreement between them, no abrupt actions, no presumptions of confidence. Harper placed a battered canteen, shining with the promise of water, right in front of Storm. She then took a handful of hay from her bag and spread it out in a loose fan so that Storm could see it but not get to it. She allowed him to examine her and make a decision by keeping her eyes down. Storm remained motionless. His body was motionless and his muscles taut as he saw the shadows clinging to the rocks. He recalled the agony of the whip, the gate's smash, and the desperate pursuit. Pain and the acrid flavor of fear were associated with humans. However, this one exuded patience, as though she was a part of the wild silence as well. The tension in the air increased. Harper fought the temptation to say something. She marked her coordinates on her phone and texted her rescue group's satellite relay. The message was straightforward: a wounded Mustang was discovered. Cautiously approaching. Storm's sides were heaving, his coat was filthy and gleaming with perspiration, and his eyes were watchful but ferociously alive when she took a short picture. Indications of trauma and injury. After folding her hands and putting the phone aside, she prepared to wait. As the sun arced westward and shadows crept across the depression, the hours stretched. When a fly landed on Harper's arm or her back started to hurt, she didn't react. Wild horses, she had discovered, gauged safety not by closeness but by patience. Never pressing, never begging, she offered her presence like an open door, letting the day unfold as it would. Without ever turning around, Storm walked around the far side of the clearing. Fear overcame his appetite as he peered suspiciously at the hay and canteen. He stretched his neck several times and sniffed at the air before pulling away. Harper remained still. She didn't say anything. She experienced the old pain of empathy, the agony of seeing a wounded animal struggle with memories that no one could take away. One tentative step at a time, Storm finally approached as the sun started to set and the light turned to honey. He stopped, all of his muscles twitching, ears pinned back. He snorted softly and dropped his head, his lips grazing the hay, as if he were about to run at the first sign of trouble. He took another mouthful when nothing came of it, then raised his head and looked at Harper as though he could read the truth from her silence. Harper grinned, her mouth twitching just a little. She didn't speak or make an effort to connect. She allowed wonder and thankfulness to gently rest on her shoulders as she observed the untamed Mustang, each line of suffering and history etched in his beaten body. She understood the importance of this brittle trust and how difficult and quickly it might be lost. This was the start, the first flimsy link between misery and hope. Storm's mane was tousled by a breeze. His throat was dry, but the cool water from the canteen helped him drink. This was the first time that curiosity overcame fear. He watched the woman with a fresh, perplexed curiosity as he chewed another piece of hay. The air cooled as twilight rolled across the desert, and coyotes from the far hills started calling once more. At the sound, Storm winced but did not flee. Harper, sensing that this time was sufficient, rose slowly, her movements soft and theatrical. After gathering her belongings and leaving some extra hay, she retreated in the same manner as before, keeping her body low and not turning around until she was almost completely obscured by the darkness. With his head up, Storm watched her leave, his pain blending with the strange taste of hope. He had not yet recovered. He wasn't safe yet. However, the air in the desert had altered, and a new possibility that was as delicate as the nightfall descended over them both. And Storm lay down in the hollow, alone but not quite as lost as before, as night grew deeper. For the first time since the chase started, he closed his eyes and let the cold darkness to envelop him. His final thought was one of cautious, hesitant trust rather than terror. The desert held its breath in a pattern as old as bone for days. The rocks were first painted gold, then grey, and then bruised violet as the sun rose and set. Every dawn, Storm awoke rigid and aching, his wounds hurting, and the only sound in the world was the rustle of wind in brittle sage. Torn between two worlds, the one that had taught him to run and the one that now offered gentle hands and quiet mercy, he waited for Harper's return on the first day following their encounter with a mixture of need and dread. Harper returned at daybreak, moving in the same manner as before, slowly, non-threateningly, and mindful of unseen lines. She set up camp at a deliberate distance, never getting too close to crowd Storm but always in his line of sight. She brought basic supplies, always carefully arranged, including feed, fresh water, and a damaged first aid box. Satisfied to watch and wait, she sat with her knees up and a hat over her eyes. Harper had learnt the importance of patience from both horse and country, and the desert served as a teacher. The first breakthrough was made in silence. Weak with hunger, Storm crept over to the circle of hay that had been left there the night before. His tentative steps were put to the test by the spectres of memory and suffering. Harper delved into her kit, not for him, but for herself, realizing how delicate the situation was. She winced as she rolled up her sleeve and dabbed a small amount of antiseptic on a gash on her forearm. Her actions were open and slow as she wrapped a bandage. Storm looked on, his nose trembling, attempting to figure out what this rite was all about. It was just the routine task of dressing a wound outdoors, with no trick or danger. She slowly brought her supplies closer to the boundary of his unseen comfort zone. Water, feed, and the first aid kit are all in plain sight and are never hurried. She left them at the edge of the area he claimed, a tactful invitation but never an order. Harper would step back a bit more every day, always allowing Storm to fill the space. Storm started to push the limits. His desire for safety outweighed the allure of food and water. Occasionally, he would wait until Harper was almost gone, her outline fading against the hills, before going out to eat or drink. At other times, he would be overcome by a frantic terror and run away, his pulse pounding as though the past itself were pursuing him, the dust swirling beneath his hoofs. But each time, he would make his way back, tentatively, inch by inch, driven by hope and hunger to the area where the smell of a person no longer signified suffering. A fresh pattern appeared by the third day. Humming gently, Harper sat with her back to the table, writing in a worn notebook or cleaning her boots. Although she didn't say much, her presence was consoling, a dependable rock in the shifting terrain. The sound of her voice, the soft rise and fall of a melody carried by the wind, drew Storm in. He saw her hands, her languid movements, and the way she always gave him room. Trust increased in barely perceptible steps rather than in big leaps. A jackrabbit jumped out of the underbrush one afternoon after being spooked by an invisible danger. Every muscle in his body tightened for escape as the storm frightened him. Harper merely laughed, a soft, low sound rather than the piercing bark of order, yet he wheeled, ready to go. Storm hesitated, shuddering, the panic subsiding as swiftly as it had appeared. The invisible barrier between them briefly loosened, allowing a sense of relief to enter. Harper made the decision to take a chance on a minor advance later that day. Wincing at the sting, she placed a little on the back of her own hand after pouring antiseptic on them and pretending to inhale the liquid. After setting the bottle at the edge of her camp, she moved the first aid equipment even closer to Storm's sleeping quarters while maintaining an exaggeratedly sluggish gait. He watched with caution as she used a fresh cloth to gently wipe a scrape from her own wrist. The breeze carried the harsh, strange, but unthreatening smell of medicine. It was a performance of trust intended just for his eyes, a lesson in vulnerability. Harper looked away after she was done, pulling her knees to her chest and waiting. Tensed as a wire, the minutes dragged. At last, curiosity and hunger triumphed over fear. Storm smelt the air and took one step, then another, his muzzle trembling. He snorted, pushed the kit with his nose, and pulled back, but to no avail. Harper was waiting, her breath quiet and measured, with no rope and no unexpected movement. Storm approached more closely than ever that night as the desert sky turned scarlet. With her fingers curled and a few bits of feed lying in the cup of her hand, Harper extended her palm. Her other hand remained motionless, and visible on her knee. With shaking muscles and wide eyes, Storm stretched his neck. He hesitated for a long, tense time, then briefly touched her fingertips with the frigid tip of his nose before grabbing the food and backing away. Harper felt a rush, or mixed with thankfulness and delight. She remained silent and simply grinned into the fading darkness while her heart raced. Uncertain but full of possibilities, Storm chewed without moving his eyes off her. The line had moved, albeit very slightly. Every day after that brought small, shuddering steps forward. Storm learnt to stand within a few steps of Harper, to eat while she was close, and to drink while she observed. She didn't want him to ever be tame. Her desire was straightforward, for the anguish to start to subside, for hope to take root, and for the fear to lose its hold. Harper muttered her gratitude in the stillness of the Nevada night, when the stars were blinking awake and coyotes were howling in the distance. It didn't matter that she wasn't sure if Storm understood. Sometimes it just took a few inches, a single step, to make a huge difference. And both humans and horses found motivation to try again under that expansive, untamed sky. It was never a lovely morning in the high desert. Dust was lifted in thin, stinging veils by the wind, which clawed at the edges of morning, removing the chill from the rocks and replaced it with a hot edge. Storm awoke with his head lowered, muscles stiff but healing, and a crust of dried blood at his shoulder. As though the universe itself held its breath, preparing for whatever happened next, every sound, the whisper of grass, the flap of a raven's wing, felt more acute. The tense calm had lasted for 3 days. Harper never broke the patience routine she had established with Storm, coming back every morning. As brittle as spring grass, trust had taken root, and Storm was getting closer to her camp every day. Her palm trembled with cautious hope as he let her to brush dust from his side, pausing every few seconds to allow him to choose how much contact he could tolerate. The desert, however, was hardly a haven. Rumors riding the wind had spread throughout the valley that Ramona was returning for her treasure. She could not tolerate disobedience. She gathered her workers in the early morning hours, trucks idling, men and women grim-faced behind mirrored sunglasses, her pride stinging and her reputation wounded. Now everyone was watching. There would be no errors. Storm had sought shelter in a shallow but dangerous canyon. Brush and greasewood clung to life in crevices and seams, while ragged stone teeth circled the bowl. Harper had made a wise choice for her location, difficult terrain for cars, yet open enough to notice danger approaching. She positioned herself next to a juniper stand, with supplies nearby, a radio fastened to her belt, and a charged phone. By midday, the silence was broken. First one truck, then another, blasted up the sandy lane. A flock of birds, scattered as the boom broke the stillness. With his nostrils flaring and his eyes blazing with terror, Storm raised his head. He recognized the undertone of human perspiration, the greasy tang of engines, and the scent of gasoline. He made his way over to Harper's camp in hopes of finding solace in her calm company. Ramona was the first figure to ascend. Her boots were spotless, her hair was pulled back in a fierce braid, and her mouth was set in a line that might have drawn blood. After calculating and scanning the ground, she gave the order for her crew to spread out and box in the canyon. The hood was surrounded by a cloud of dust as a third vehicle idled on the rim. Engines stuttering, dirt bikers circled, eager for action. Ramona stepped forward, and Harper stood. With her chin up and her back straight, she held her hands visible. When she talked, her heart pounded in her chest, yet her voice was steady. Harper stated flatly, not giving an inch, "This isn't your ground. He is not your possession. Being a living being, he has the capacity to heal and make decisions. Ramona squinted her eyes. My horse is him. He disturbed my business, hurt my team, and smashed my fences. Interfering in ranch affairs that don't affect you is trespassing. Hot as gunmetal, a standoff developed between them. Some crew members were unsure, while others were excited for the command to take over. Despite his stiff muscles, Storm's trust was stronger than his dread as he edged behind Harper. He snorted and pawed at the dirt, prepared to run if necessary. Harper, however, refused to back down. She took out her phone, pressed record, and held it up for everyone to see. Let's do this openly if you wish to make it official. According to recent state legislation, Mustangs are not considered private property. They are protected by the federal government. And it would be a violation to try to capture him today, given his condition. The moment's weight hung in the air. Her GPS pin and texts called Harper's backup, a deputy sheriff's cruiser, which nosed around the bend. With one hand resting loosely on his belt, the deputy went outside. He surveyed the scene, Ramona enraged, Harper composed but unyielding, the ring of trucks, the lone Mustang watching them from the shade. The deputy added, everyone needs to take a breath. Today, nobody is going beyond any boundaries. Statements will be taken, and I anticipate complete cooperation. Until wildlife and animal control experts evaluate the case, the Mustang remains in place. Ramona tensed, gripping her jaw until a vein surged through her neck. For the first time, she glanced around and saw suspicious eyes instead of her devoted followers, some of her crew members exchanging doubtful looks, not knowing where this was going. Water poured through her fingertips, making the strength she had used so easily feel slick. It's not worth it, boss, one of her guys muttered, and Ramona gave him a fierce look. The deputy interrupted her as she attempted to argue. Enough? You are aware of the stakes, there are witnesses, and there is video. Harper was instantly relieved, but she maintained a neutral expression while observing every movement in Ramona's posture. Sensing that the danger was lessening, Storm cautiously moved forward, perhaps taking strength from the woman who was protecting him. Ramona's pride was in ruins as she spat in the dust. You're doing something wrong. That animal will always cause problems. Harper merely nodded in a quiet voice. Perhaps. However, he merits the opportunity to disprove you. Ramona's people withdrew one by one. Dirt bikes followed as the trucks withdrew. The deputy remained, taking notes and vowing to submit the appropriate reports. Harper provided a thorough and lucid narrative, detailing Storm's injuries as well as the proof of abuse and neglect. With her case sealed and the recording safe, she gave over her phone. The canyon fell silent, scarcely disturbed by the wind, as the final truck vanished. Storm approached Harper with a calm body and a lowered head. For the first time, his eyes were filled with thankfulness and a sort of belief rather than dread. Word got around fast. That day, a boundary was established between the old methods and a new, hard-won respect for things that could never be fully owned, not simply between rancher and wild horse. As it watched, the desert appeared to breathe more easily. And the seeds of trust and freedom, sown in sweat and dust, grew in the canyon's protection. An unsettling calm settled in after the conflict dissipated into the desert wind. Beyond the ridge, the last of Ramona's trucks disappeared, their tire tracks being worn away by agitated winds. It was as though the entire canyon stopped to gather its breath in the ensuing quiet. Harper remained motionless, her hand softly by her side, until the deputy's cruiser vanished. Only then did she exhale a long, trembling breath, feeling simultaneously relieved and exhausted. With sides heaving and nostrils, still trembling from the lingering smell of terror and gasoline, Storm hung near. He didn't run, though. He gazed at Harper through those deep, shadowed, fathomless eyes as though attempting to predict the future, wondering what would occur now that the status quo had changed. The land seemed like possibilities, not just survival, for the first time. The searing pain in his shoulder that had been there for days had turned into a dull ache. Rest, drink, and the kindness of a stranger had all helped to bind up his wounds. Harper worked quietly and resolutely throughout the following day. The local rescue group officials showed up, a man in an official vest with a clipboard and a steady, professional voice, and two ladies in faded ball caps with sun-lined features. They took notes on Storm's condition and injuries, took pictures, and assessed the area together. They set up a makeshift soft corral, a half-circle made of canvas and movable fence panels that was open to the wind but sufficiently enclosed to prevent Storm from roaming while his injuries healed. Storm gave the new building a suspicious look. The rescue crew was wise enough not to push him inside. Rather, they constructed the corral around the area where he already felt secure, advancing the panels 1 inch at a time, never rushing, and always observing his responses. Harper remained nearby, a comforting anchor. While checking the soft walls and keeping an eye out for any indication of a trap, Storm went around them. Something deeper and more subdued than terror, prevented him from running away. Storm was given an option for the first time since the round pen back at the ranch. Harper explained everything in detail. As she worked, she talked to him in a steady, low voice. An offering but never a demand, she placed a halter on the dust at the edge of the pen, out of his reach. She brought hay and fresh water, putting them down with the same meticulous ceremony that had characterized each day of their shaky alliance. The rescue crew assembled outside the corral as the sun started to slowly set. Harper was leaning against the fence with a worn notebook in one hand, and the canvas's velvety edge in the other. The words floated out on the warm breeze, but she spoke softly, more to herself than to the others. He has 2 paths ahead of him. We could take him in, tend to his injuries, and, if he's willing, provide him a place to stay. Or, she gazed out to the huge, unending expanse of desert. Or we let him pick his own path by opening the gate. No fences, no ropes. Just freedom, if he desires it. The others nodded, realizing the significance of what she had spoken. Harper felt one of the women place a hand on her shoulder and squeeze it. You did him a favor. That's his narrative to tell, whatever he decides. Softly, the evening descended, casting long, blue shadows on the canyon walls. The smell of dust and mint permeated the chilly air. It was time to make a choice. With steady hands and a frenzied heart, Harper made her way to the gate. Her motions were slow and deliberate as she unlatched the soft panel, and swung it wide before taking a step back. Torn between the unknown and the security he had discovered in Harper's silent waiting, Storm stood at the edge of the opening. He took one look back, his eyes lingering on those who had allowed him time to recover, who had not asked for his confidence, who had waited and waited until he was ready. With her hands by her sides and her entire body expressing, "It's your choice now," Harper stood a few feet away. Storm approached her slowly. He lowered his head and stopped just out of arm's reach. Harper's fingers were shaking with hope as she held out her hand, palm up. There was no movement for a heartbeat. Then, to their amazement, Storm pressed his scarred neck into her hand and allowed her to touch him as an equal, not as a project or a prisoner. It was an unspoken expression of gratitude, a pledge of trust made but not accepted. Harper blinked aside the tears she had vowed not to cry as she grinned. Feeling the warmth of Storm's flesh and the untamed strength behind the scars, she briefly rested her hand. Then she relaxed, taking a step back to give him time to make up his mind. Beyond the gate was the golden, boundless desert, teeming with danger and opportunity. Storm paused for a second, flicking one ear back at Harper. Then, When the breeze brushed across his mane, he took a stride forward, nostrils blazing. At the very doorway, he stopped and gave himself a final, inquisitive look that appeared to be asking, "Will you remember me? Are you going to let me leave?" Harper nodded, her voice drowned out by the silence of the evening. Storm ventured out into the open for the first time. Then another. It was his decision, and his decision only. Not rushing, not running, but reclaiming the wild as his own, he moved with unhurried, purposeful ease. In reverent stillness, the rescue crew watched as Storm vanished into the shadow and sage, his body vanishing into the encroaching darkness. Nobody said anything. Nobody applauded. This was neither a win nor a defeat. It was just right, a legend allowed to flourish, a life put back on course. Harper sat at the edge of the corral as darkness descended, feeling the day's burden transform into something gentler and quieter. Even if Storm was no longer there, his promise was preserved in memory and dust. His story would unfold in the wild, molded by his own volition. And Harper, her voice shaking in the darkness, muttered her gratitude under the same sky. She knew she couldn't give freedom as a gift. It was a natural right that she could only protect. Storm, and all the wild souls who had ever yearned for the open gate, owned the desert tonight. In the high desert of Nevada, word spread quickly. Storm's story was unfolding over crackling phone lines and dusty roadways even before his hoofprints vanished from the gentle dust at the edge of the canyon. As Storm slid by the open gate, his mane wild in the dusk, his scars shining silver in the last of the golden light, someone took a grainy picture. By morning, the picture had been shared on social media, texted, and emailed. The caption said, "Wild Mustang chooses freedom," and the hashtags #LetThemRun and #Storm the legend blazed beneath it. The story was initially reported by the local news. Harper was still sitting close to the corral, coffee cooling between her hands, and her boots dust powdering when a young reporter, new to the beat but quick to spot a headline, arrived at dawn. In her slow, methodical manner, she told the story, omitting nothing, not the hunt, not the wounds, not the evenings spent waiting for trust to develop. As he drove away, his tires making little whirls in the sand, the reporter listened, scribbled, and took a picture of the empty corral. The story quickly gained traction, being picked up by local stations, blogs about animal welfare, and even a few national outlets eager to publish a unique and optimistic story. Storm turned into a symbol of something more than just one escape. People sat at coffee shops and cafes, arguing about rights, about wildness, and about who actually owned the land and its creatures in front of flashing screens and faded newspapers. Almost before the first headline appeared, Ramona sensed the change. With the shades shut and the phone vibrating with calls she didn't want to answer, she paced her office. She initially attempted to dismiss it as a fleeting moment, and a sentimental diversion. However, the pressure increased. Journalists were contacted by former workers who told them about their rigorous training and strict rules. A video appeared showing Ramona in the round enclosure with Storm's gaze angry and unbowed, and the whip raised. The remarks became offensive. Sponsors were urged to re-evaluate their collaborations. A planned protest was subtly called off. Bit by bit, she saw her reputation crumble. Prior to the posts sagging and the entire structure collapsing, it was like witnessing a fence rot from the inside out. It was unfair, she told herself. She had only done what ranchers always did, which was to maintain order and safeguard investments. However, everything around her had changed, and what had once been regarded as capable leadership now appeared fragile and callous. Harper, meantime, was receiving requests she never would have thought to accept, invitations to speak at animal welfare panels, podcasts, and interviews. When she first tried to explain what it meant to wait, and wait, for a wild horse to trust you, she stumbled because she wasn't used to the camera's attention. However, the narrative developed on its own. At bedtime, parents read it to their kids. Motivated by the belief that respect and patience may make a small but significant difference in the world, volunteers flocked to the rescue center. With an odd mixture of pride and horror, Storm's legend was spoken back at the ranch. Some of the valley's more recent residents spoke of it in amazement, while others used it as a warning: never turn your back on a Mustang, not if he's got fight left in him. In the evenings, they would drive out in the hopes of spotting a wild mane along the ridgeline, watching the horizon for the flicker of movement that would indicate Storm was still out there, unhindered and free. Harper went to the municipal library one evening to attend a community meeting. There were many people in the room, and there was a buzz of inquiries and comments. Parents inquired about the safety of their children. Ranchers complained about lost livestock and damaged fences. However, a teenager at the rear held up her hand and questioned, "Why must the horses change for us? Why are we unable to adapt for them?" There was silence in the room. Harper gave the most truthful response she could. "If we have the patience and the will," she remarked, "we can." The rescue center developed into a silent focus of transformation. Bales of hay used tack, envelopes with $10 and the words, "For Storm and all the others," were sent by strangers. Volunteers volunteered to assist in tracking wild herds using drones and video traps, recording every sighting and injury. They received instruction from wildlife officers on how to construct soft corrals, employ gentle herding techniques rather than ATVs, and view wildness as a resource rather than an issue. The repercussions came to Ramona with unrelenting conviction. Public uproar and growing evidence prompted the Animal Protection Board to begin an investigation. She attempted to defend her techniques in interviews, but the tide had swung. Her speaking engagements dwindled, sponsors left, and even some of her most seasoned employees discreetly resigned. She was by herself in her large home on the ranch's border, and she could not deny the accusation as she looked out her window at the empty round enclosure. Sometimes at night, she could hear coyotes all the way up to her porch. Ramona pondered when she had last listened to the wildness of the country rather than attempting to control it, as she searched the horizon, hoping to catch a glimpse of a Mustang's movement against the lunar sage. Storm became a sort of metaphor for the rest of the valley, a reminder that pride and barbed wire could not hold back freedom once it had tasted. He was depicted leaping beneath the thunderclouds in murals created by artists. On the sidewalk outside the library, kids used colored chalk to draw his likeness. When Harper went, elderly men who had dedicated their careers to patching up differences tipped their caps, sometimes out of respect and other times in a silent apology. The question that now permeated every discussion, every gathering, and every silent time spent gazing out over the vast, wild area beyond the last fence, however, was arguably the strongest echo: what if wildness was a gift to be preserved rather than a problem to be solved? What if the world could truly be changed by faith and patience? Storm raced someplace in the wide, undulating wilderness, no longer a runaway but a legend, bearing the tale of a decision made at dusk and the lives irrevocably altered by a single open gate. The rhythms of the desert took on a new pulse in the weeks that followed Storm's fabled escape. It was no longer merely a story told in coffee shops or whispered around fence posts. It was alive in the valley, ingrained in everyday activities, and winning over the hearts of both newcomers and old-timers. Harper addressed a group of wide-eyed kids at the nearby elementary school, and the room fell silent. As she held up a student-made painting, she spoke softly but confidently while kneeling next to the library's reading rug. The crayon drawing depicted the open gate behind Storm, a mane of fire, the boundless desert in front of him, and Storm mid-gallop. As Harper explained that often the toughest thing was not to catch or tame but to let go, to believe that another being, even a wild horse, could know what was best for itself, the kids leaned in, listening intently to every word. A sandy-haired young lad held up his hand. His voice drifted off, half query, half promise, if Storm could do it, maybe I could try too, even when I'm scared. Harper grinned as she felt a gentle sensation in her chest. She remarked, "You're braver than you realize, and sometimes courage is just trying again after being hurt." In other places, Storm's story had served as a trigger for fresh discussions and the healing of old wounds. The proprietor of the Soul Diner in town displayed a news article about Storm above the coffee maker. Over breakfast plates, patrons quarreled about whether the ranchers had gone too far and if more needed to be done to save the untamed horses. Some were obstinate and sluggish to abandon tradition. However, even they appeared quiet, their arrogant bravado tempered by the public display of Harper's determination and Ramona's collapse. The pastor of the church used Storm's story into his preaching on Sunday mornings. He talked about humility and how listening and choosing mercy over power may sometimes be more powerful than dominance. As the crowd imagined the open gate, the scarred Mustang, and the hands that had refused to close it, silence would descend on the pews. Volunteers gathered around laptops and maps at the local rescue center. The organization, which had previously solely been concerned with providing food for stray dogs, now has a new goal: tracking the herds of Mustangs, figuring out their habits, and trying to raise awareness of humane management. Volunteers and wildlife officers worked together to fix damaged fence lines, check fence lines, and post signs warning drivers to slow for animals crossing the road. There is now alertness where there was previously only indifference. Motivated by Harper's visits to their classes, the kids took the lead. Bright with dusty golds and sky blues, they created murals of Storm on the community center's walls. The wild horse is a representation of possibility and hope. In their writings, older students discussed what freedom meant and made the case for stronger anti-cruelty legislation and financial support for rescue efforts. Teachers incorporated the lessons into their curricula. History lectures discussed the changing legacy of the American West, while biology classes examined the native grasses that fed the Mustangs. Even some of the older cowhands, who had remained silent at Ramona's round pen, began to reconsider the distinctions they had made between us and them. The former head wrangler stood and cleared his throat during a town hall meeting. His remarks rang with honesty despite his gravelly voice. Somewhere back there, he acknowledged, we crossed a line and forgot what it meant to share this land. Perhaps it's time to improve, both for the horses and for ourselves. For a long time, there was silence in the room as the admission hit everyone like a layer of rain after a protracted dry spell. Then there was a slow but genuine wave of agreement. The town council, almost to their own surprise, agreed to form a new committee on humane management, as a result of the growing momentum. Harper and the rescue volunteers were asked to give their insights and recommendations. Harper explained in plain terms what had worked, letting the wild horses express their needs, being patient, setting gentle boundaries, and never imposing trust. She didn't give sermons. She displayed images of Storm's cautious gaze, the cautious approach, the bandaged body, the contact at the corral gate, and the untamed escape. She let the pictures do the talking. As she distributed brochures for the new monitoring network, a retired teacher who is now participating with the rescue group summed it up this way: from one horse, a whole town changed. Her remarks resonated and were repeated by many who had before laughed at soft-hearted animal lovers. The network of oversight expanded rapidly. At first reluctant, local ranchers started reporting injuries and called in sightings instead of grabbing their rifles. Once employed to track for culling, wildlife cameras and drones now assist in monitoring the herds, mapping their movements and making sure water holes remain safe and clear. Eager to contribute to something meaningful, college students enrolled in summer internship programs. Harper even discovered that she had altered. Standing in the main office of the rescue, she studied a map on which the network had recorded Storm's final several sightings, close to the river, over a vast expanse of sage, and always just out of reach. Though not with regret, Her heart hurt with longing. Deep down, she realized that there would always be danger associated with independence. However, Storm's world had expanded, and his story had provided opportunities for others who were similar to him. The community got together for a storytelling session at the school gym one evening. They listened, rancher and retiree, young and old, as Harper retold the story, her voice more powerful now, her nerves soothed by the sea of faces she knew. There was silence after she was done, followed by quiet, sincere applause. "He's still out there, right?" a child said from the front row. With a knot in her throat, Harper nodded. "We're all a little freer because he's out there." Storm moved through the shadows outside, under the wide western sky, his hoofprints creating fresh trails as his legend ran ahead of him. The people who used to draw boundaries between wild and tame were now standing together in the town, finally understanding what it meant to share hope as well as land. Secrets were seldom kept long in the desert. The echoes of Storm's wild run remained in the air, as enduring as the smell of sage after rain, even as weeks turned into months and the sharpest edges of his mythology grew softer. A dark Mustang with its hair matted with dust and eyes glinting under the setting sun would occasionally be spotted by someone despite the intense summer heat. Whether it was Storm at the edge of a canyon, his outline framed by golden light, or his hoofprints following a muddy wash following an infrequent downpour, it was always a brief moment. Some claimed to have seen him today, with his coat growing thicker and his stride becoming more powerful, scars disappearing under a fresh coat of dust and freedom, leading a small group of younger horses. Every report Harper heard was a tiny present, a thread connecting her to that crazy summer. More than just newspaper clippings and murals preserved Storm's legacy in the community. Harper found herself recounting his tale at the rescue center, not as a single miracle, but as a component of a larger lesson. She gave speeches at volunteer trainings, libraries, and schools. Her voice was solid now, and her nervousness had long since given way to the serene assurance of someone who had learned to trust the world and herself. She talked about the humility needed to let go, the patience needed to wait for a wild creature to approach her, and how one act of respect may transform the course of an entire community. She allowed the kids to run their hands over the faded leather of Storm's old halter, which was still dusty from that final day in the plush corral. She would remark, "Freedom is something you can defend, every day, in small ways. It's not something you can give." The message stuck. In their notebooks, children sketched images of untamed horses. Teens volunteered for summer fieldwork and animal surveys. Regarding how they could live with the herds that roamed the hills outside of town, parents and grandparents had serious concerns. Harper was more than just a storyteller. Together with the rescue organization, she pushed for long-lasting change by collaborating with local leaders and ranchers. The town implemented additional rules, including a requirement to report any injured animals and a ban on motorized roundups and barbed wire near water holes. A patchwork of volunteers, retired cowhands, biologists, and families who had never communicated before, the community oversight network became a permanent presence. Even Ramona, who had long since lost her previous authority, showed up at a meeting one evening, grey and silent, to hear Harper discuss the distinction between stewardship and control. Harper would occasionally find her standing at the edge of a meadow, observing the horizon, but she never spoke much. When their gazes locked, Ramona tipped her hat once, not in defeat but with a reluctant respect rooted in their common past. Though time had a way of smoothing off the sharpest edges, certain rifts never completely closed. Storm continued to exist in the valley throughout it all. His image, fuzzy and gorgeous, was occasionally captured by trail cameras as he led younger stallions through a crevice in the boulders, always just out of reach, and drinking at a hidden creek. Ranchers were able to identify the hoofprints, deeper, wider now, and characterized by the unwavering assurance of a horse that had outlived its peers. They stopped pursuing him. Some made a silent peace sacrifice by leaving water at the edge of their land during dry seasons. When questioned, even the most seasoned doubters acknowledged that the country felt more genuine when a wild Mustang was roaming around. The significance of Storm's mythology changed with the seasons. He was initially just a tale of one horse outwitting pride and fences in order to escape. The community, however, gradually started to realize what Harper had always understood. The silent revolution it provoked was more important than the escape itself. Traditional beliefs were questioned. Habits changed. Families hiked together in the hopes of seeing untamed horses grazing after sunset. The Mustangs were shown by local painters as guardians of a spirit that belonged to everyone rather than as emblems of trouble. Harper stood at the valley's edge one fall evening as the sun began to set. She saw the clouds ringed with light as the sky blazed orange and violet. She turned just in time to see a dark form crest the far ridge as she heard faint, distant hoofbeats. It was Storm, with two younger horses at his sides, his mane blown by the wind. At the top, he stopped and gazed down at the world that had failed to shatter him. His eyes briefly locked with Harper's, distant but unmistakably direct, as though to say, "You fulfilled your word. You gave me the option." Harper's eyes pricked at the corners with tears. Without anticipating a response, she held up a hand in greeting. She remembered Storm's shadow as he lingered for a minute longer before turning and leading his tiny company into the fading dusk. New faces and new hope filled the rescue center back in town. The last piece of the mural, a wild Mustang jumping over the open gate with stars whirling above, was completed by a young girl and painted on the community center wall. The girl's hands were smeared with color as she grinned up at Harper. "Won't he return at some point?" Harper gave a quiet nod. "Perhaps. Or perhaps he is exactly where he should be." A group of youngsters discovered new hoofprints along a dry stream bed later that week. They huddled together, comparing shoe sizes to prints and indicating the trail's bifurcation, one heading deeper into the hills and the other into the open range. Their voices rang with joy and wild dreams as they followed for a while. As a gift for anything that might come by during the night, several people left a bunch of apples at the bank of the creek. With each recounting, Storm's legend grew, not because he was tamed or owned, but rather because he remained wild, a symbol of what may occur when one life is given the freedom to pursue its own course. The community discovered that hope, once sown, could withstand the most severe drought, that mending took longer than most people wanted to give it, and that respect was not a sign of weakness. Storm rushed with the wind out there, his story carried on every gust under the limitless Nevada sky. Knowing that there will always be wild horses and legends to lead them home as long as there were people prepared to wait and listen, Harper grinned as she looked out over the horizon.